Like many out there, I have been obsessed with God of War Ragnarok. I've been doing a playthrough alongside my friend Sam, and we've both been really enjoying the game. One thing that struck us both while we were playing through the game was the villains. Within the first hour of God of War Ragnarok, we are immediately introduced to the three antagonists of the story. We've got Freya, we've got Odin, and we've got Thor. These are the big bads, the people who are working against our protagonist, Kratos of Sparta, and his son Atreus. And these three villains, each of them have amazing introductions that we can really learn from when we want to introduce our villains as dungeon masters in Dungeons and Dragons. Villains are a big part of D&D. We've said this constantly, but sometimes they can be the hardest thing to pull off. We've seen it done wrong countless times in RPG horror stories. I've done plenty of videos on how to do villains. Just 2 weeks ago, we did a villain video about a bad villain tip I don't like, but this time, I'm going to own up my words and give some good villain tips that I do like, based on this latest entry in the God of War franchise. We're going to be going through each antagonist here, Freya, Odin, and finally Thor, to learn what they have to teach us when it comes to introducing our villains in Dungeons and Dragons. Without further ado, let's get started. Alright, before we start anything, just fair warning, I'm going to be talking about the first hour of God of War, roughly around there. So no spoilers beyond that point, though I will be discussing stuff that happened in God of War 4, the 2018 game. So if you haven't played that yet and you still want to after 4 years, it's a great game, don't blame you. Be warned, there will be some spoilers there, but for Ragnarok, I'm just talking about the first hour. So anyway, let's get into the first antagonist that we're introduced to, Freya of the Vanir, Queen of the Valkyries. This is a character from God of War 2018 that we had already met. She was an ally in that game, but here she is now our enemy because we killed her son. And she introduces us to the first big villain introductory method that many DMs choose to use because she is the antagonist, the straight up fight. Freya out and out attacks us in a cold open battle, and I think that this is a really cool way to do it, though it can be hard to pull off. When you're trying to do the cold open battle with a villain, there's a couple things that you need to be conscientious of. Of course, you're probably not going to have your player characters kill the villain right here. Just like in this game, when Kratos and Atreus fight Freya, she doesn't die, because it would be kind of lame if a major antagonist of the story just dies right here at the beginning, wouldn't it? So you don't want that, but you also don't want your villain to kill your player characters when your adventure is just starting out or on their first meeting. You want the adventure to have some length to it, and you don't want everyone to die. So you need to be really careful with how you frame the battle and how you balance the encounter. The way God of War does it is frame it as a chase encounter. Instead of Atreus and Kratos fighting Freya, they are slaying away from her on their little sled. And I think that's a pretty good way to do it in Dungeons and Dragons as well. Chases are something that I don't do a lot in D&D just because they can be kind of hard to pull off, but I think they can be a really cool and thrilling way to build a different kind of encounter. So many encounters in D&D are kind of samey, especially after so many sessions. In my home game, I'm like, I think 55 sessions deep, and sometimes I can run out of combat encounter ideas because almost every session we have some sort of encounter, and having every single one of them be a combat can get boring after 50 plus sessions. So spicing it up with something different, like a chase, can be really, really interesting. Another big lesson that we learn here with the cold open battle is immediately we are introduced to the relationship between Kratos, Atreus, and most importantly, our antagonist in the situation, Freya. Now, this is a really relevant lesson for Dungeons and Dragons too, because often we will create BBEGs or bad guys in general that have a connection to player characters. Think Ford and Uk'otoa that's going on right now with the Mighty Nine Reunited campaign. Uk'otoa has a special connection specifically with Ford. And yeah, Matt wants to communicate that relationship to both the players and the audience by having the foes Ford is fighting comment on it. During this Freya and Kratos fight, Kratos will repeat multiple times that he does not want to fight Freya. Even if you had never played the first game before, you understand the conflict here. Freya is trying to kill him, but he does not want to kill her. There's clearly a past relationship there, a past friendship. And communicating that to your players is really, really important, especially if only one player understands who the hell this is. Often, players won't explain their entire backstories to the entire party. That's probably for the best. But you, as the DM, can give them little minor hints. This also is a big tip for giving roleplay during combat and allowing players to give those hints themselves. It's not always the DM that has to hint at something greater. Sometimes players have secrets in their backstories that they can hint with, and you can communicate with players through text or through private conversation to set that up before the combat starts. In essence, Freya here is teaching us a couple things. First, she's teaching us that not every encounter with your bad guy needs to be an out-and-out fight. The cold open can instead be something like a chase to keep the thrill without the danger of either killing off your villain or killing off your party. And also, communicating the relationship between the antagonist and the characters is really, really important and is often done through roleplay during a combat. All of this is a really important lesson that you can use to create some really cool cold open battles with a bad guy, introducing them to the players in an epic fashion. Next up, Odin. Now I know, Odin is actually the BBEG, so you're probably expecting him to be the last character I talk about, but Thor has more lessons to teach, so he's last. Especially since, spoiler, I guess, you fight him, not Odin. Odin teaches us a different kind of introduction to your bad guy. Freya is the out-and-out fight, cold open battle. But Odin is different. Odin is a straight-up role-play encounter. Odin is chill as hell. He just knocks on your door and walks in. And this is another really cool way to introduce your villain that I'll admit I haven't done enough, and actually, this is my favorite way to do it. So, introducing your villain with calm, collected roleplay is really just damn cool. First and foremost, it eliminates that risk that combat can pose when you're doing it early on before you plan your final battle, so to speak. Like I said in the Freya point, you don't want your villain to kill your heroes, you don't want your heroes to kill your villain too early in the story. So having it being a role-play encounter instead kind of removes that risk, and it subverts expectations a little bit. I mean, we expect to be fighting our antagonists. We don't expect them to knock on our door and sit down for mead, right? So this is actually really interesting, and it immediately communicates the character of Odin. Freya's the kind of girl who wants to fight, but Odin's the kind of guy who wants to talk. We can tell that immediately by him just walking in. He's not the fighter kind. But there is a problem here. How do we have this happen in the first place? A lot of the time, players are just going to fight. They're just going to attack. And there are a variety of ways to do this. Odin shows us one way we can kind of force our players into the roleplay, by having a palpable threat be in the room if they don't roleplay. Right now, Kratos is standing in his house with two figures, Thor and Odin, both of which pose a threat. Right now, they're being civil, so Kratos doesn't really want to fight, because if he does fight, he doesn't know what's going to happen. He doesn't know if he can take both on, because he hasn't met these people before. That's another way that you could do it with your players. Communicate that these people are dangerous, and right now, they just want to talk. Your players are probably going to be incentivized to engage in that talk, because if they don't, things can get violent, and your players don't know how that's going to turn out. The way I did it with my players is to have it happen in a neutral or even purposefully peaceful environment. The villain met the party inside of a dinner party with a bunch of people everywhere. If an all-out fight breaks out, innocent lives could be at stake. And I understand not every player cares about that, but mine do. And also, there's witnesses. If they straight up murder a respected member of the court, aka the villain, it might pose problems from them later on. So instead, they choose to engage in the conversation the villain wants to have. Furthermore, the contents of Odin's conversation here matters. Odin does something that I think is oversaid, but is still important. He subverts our expectations. Odin does something that not a lot of villains do. Odin walks into the house, and when asked what he wants, he just says, peace. He wants peace. Not peace through force, not like the Emperor Palpatine kind of peace. He just wants Kratos, the main character, to just not fight. He just wants him to kick up his feet and stay in his home. That's it. Which kind of lines up with what Kratos wants. Kratos has been content to hide in the woods this entire game. In fact, Kratos and his son just had an argument about it like an hour ago. And Odin walks in, basically telling Kratos, hey, I'll give you what you want. I want you just to sit here and stay here, just like what you intend to do. Having your villain buy into exactly what the players want is a good way to make them very uncomfortable. Your players know not to trust this. They know that this is the bad guy. Odin has already been introduced to the players, maybe not directly, but through stories. We know he's bad. So him telling Kratos exactly what he wants to hear, that makes him uncomfortable. He wants to believe it, but he can't because it's Odin. It's the bad guy. Your players are probably going to be the same way if you pull the same stunt. There are plenty of ways to pull off this manipulative bad guy, but this is one of my favorites. Buying into what your players want is a good way to make them a little bit iffy about the bad guy, and I love this calm, collected introduction to Odin. Odin also communicates a lot about his character through the way he talks to both you, the player characters, as well as his allies. A lot of time I forget to take advantage of goons. Villains can also talk to their underlings, and the way someone talks to their underlings can communicate a lot about them. I mean, right here, Odin goes into the room, Thor is also sitting there by the way, and makes fun of his dead children.
Now, what you did to his boys, self-defense. Dying is what we Aesir live for. And let's be honest, they were kinda useless.
That's pretty messed up, and that communicates a lot about who he is and his relationship with his underling, aka his own son. Odin teaches us about the calm, collected introduction, using your roleplay to communicate both their personality and their methods, making your players a little bit uncomfy in a healthy in-game sense by giving them exactly what they want from the bad guy. I think this is a really cool introduction, but with Odin and with Freya, we've got roleplay and we've got combat. With Thor, we've got the best of both worlds. Guys, I'm not kidding here. This Thor fight is one of my favorite parts of the whole game. This battle with Thor is incredible, mostly because it does not happen when you expect it to. Thor rocks up to the house, hammer in hand, and he doesn't fight. Instead, he just says that he has mead and walks into the home. However, not only does this subvert expectations, because we know about villains, we know they usually want to fight, and we also know about Thor. His personality has been communicated to us through the previous game. We've been told many stories about the horrible war crimes he's committed, but here he just walks in with some ale. And you know what? That's not exactly what we're expecting. But beyond that, this conversation, this encounter is not exactly civil. It's incredibly threatening. There is a palpable tension to it all. It's very similar to the Odin encounter, but with less words exchanged. A lot of the time, I as a DM can kind of forget that roleplay doesn't just happen with dialogue. The way characters act is also part of roleplay. Describing how your villain puts his hammer on the table as a sign of both respect and a subtle threat is some really cool stuff. Not everything about a character needs to be communicated with the words that they say. A lot of what we see here is physical with Thor. And I know that D&D is a different medium from a video game. D&D is not visual, it's imaginative. And if anything, that can kind of free up your shackles. This whole game has to be created, painstakingly, modeled, and animated. But with you as a dungeon master, you just need to describe things. Description is powerful, and using description of a character's physical actions can be really cool for communicating the way that they act and are. Having a character of few words can be really interesting, especially for an antagonist. But it's not just the civil conversation that communicates about his character. Again, spoiler, I guess. Thor eventually just rockets you through the roof of your own home and initiates one of the best fights in the entire game. Maybe not in terms of difficulty, but in terms of story. Thor here teaches us a really important lesson about combat, something else that we learned from Freya. Role-playing during combat is a powerful thing. Thor teaches us to maximize the time we have with our villain. This is a minor spoiler, but Kratos doesn't actually meet Thor again until the very end of the game. And honestly, for a Dungeons & Dragons game, that's perfectly realistic for you as well. Often, we don't have a lot of time with our BBEGs, our antagonists. Often, your players are introduced to them, they don't meet the villain for a while, and then they're reintroduced right at the very end when they have the final battle. Sometimes it's not going to be the case, but often we are more reserved with our villains. That's not for a bad thing. If you have them appear every single session, it can kind of get repetitive. But maximizing the time you have with your villain is really, really important. Thor here communicates his character in a short roleplay scene and then during a longer form combat. This maximizes the efficiency of what we have going on here. Throughout this entire encounter, both roleplay and combat, Thor's communicating his character, who he is. If Thor wasn't talking during this fight, this wouldn't be nearly as cool. He's communicating multiple things. He's communicating that he understands who Kratos is, building up that character relationship. He's communicating that he doesn't really take this fight seriously. He's just trying to pull Kratos' monster side out of him, which again shows a little bit more about his character. And there's a little bit more subversion when he communicates that he cares about his children, which is strange because in the first game, we saw him beat one of them nearly to death. It shows a little bit of character inconsistency that will be clarified later in the game.
You think you can come here, become a daddy, get a clean slate? That ain't how it works. You're a destroyer, like me.
All of these details are just communicated through the short combat encounter and the dialogue that Thor has during this. As a DM, I've said this I know I've gave many me examples, but I'm just going to give another one here. As a DM, I'm really bad with role-playing during combat. There's so much going on. If you watch Shadow of the Colossus, you know I kind of over-design combat sometimes with a lot of different moving parts and elements. And yeah, during all those moving parts and elements, I can kind of forget about role-playing. However, a little neat trick I have is to just write down some dialogue, write down some line. I know a lot of people frown upon writing down any sort of dialogue beforehand. It feels like scripting, but having some miscellaneous dialogue that you can just throw out during a combat encounter, I don't think that's a bad thing. It allows you to free up your mind a little bit so you can come up with something a little bit more hardtack later on down the line in the combat. Now, again, I want to say, I don't want you to script out your D&D game, but little miscellaneous pieces of dialogue just to build up the character that you're playing and the villain in this moment, that can be really helpful. Also, I know this is more of a gameplay thing, and there's going to be a disconnect. D&D is a tabletop role-playing game. God of War is a video game. Disconnect there. But it's important to remember that if you're going to introduce your villain with a roleplay or a combat, you need to remember it has to be memorable. I know that's really generic. Make it good isn't exactly a point I want to put in the video, but it is important to know that your combat shouldn't be boring at the very least. In this fight, Thor rockets Kratos all the way to the Lake of Nine, having a huge battle that spans the entirety of the temple, culminating in creating a frozen lightning bolt with the impact of both their weapons. That's memorable. Now, of course, I don't think you should have this exact same set piece, and maybe not to this extreme degree, but making sure that something memorable happens is important. Give your BBG some kind of super mega attack. Have them activate some of their lair actions or surprise a player with some kind of epic spell. Something like that will help stick them in your players' minds. It shouldn't just be another run-of-the-mill encounter, right? I know I throw a lot out there with Thor, but here, I'll summarize all of these lessons. First and foremost, maximize the time you have with your villains. When you have an encounter with your villains, you want to build up their character, especially the initial encounter. We learn so much about Thor just through this combat. Your players should learn something about your villains through their first encounter as well. First impressions mean a lot. Make sure it's a good one. Next up, remember to roleplay during the combat. Make sure that you don't let your villains stay silent. It can help them be memorable by having them taunt the main characters or communicate something about their own character to the party. Number 3, from a gameplay standpoint, something needs to happen during the combat. If you want to introduce your villain through a fight, it can't be a boring fight. Make it unique or interesting in some way, either through a set piece or some kind of mechanic so it sticks in your players' minds. All in all 3 of these characters, all 3 of these antagonists can teach us some good lessons on how to introduce your bad guy. That first impression is so important, and I hope that it helped you guys to make a better first impression with your own bad guys in your D&D games. If you guys enjoyed, then please do leave a like. If you want to see more of my content, then you can check out my RPG horror story series where we cover the best of the worst of Dungeons & Dragons. And while you're there in the cards, subscribe to Crispy's Tavern to get more of our content as it comes out. And finally, if you want to leave your own stories or thoughts, go down to the comments down below. If you can't think of a comment, leave the comment Norse gods to let me know you made it to the end of the video. In essence, like, comment, subscribe. I'll see you all next time. Farewell.